She was never his choice. She was his kingdom's condition. Jocelyn Ashbourne had understood that from the morning her father sat across from her at the breakfast table with grief so deep it had gone completely quiet, and explained, in a voice barely above a whisper, that the war was over and the terms had been set. The Alpha King of Veldmore did not want gold. He did not want land. He wanted a bride from the bloodline that had dared to stand against him, a living symbol that the Ashbourne name had been brought to heel. And so Jocelyn agreed. Not because she had no choice, though the choices were few, but because she was her father's daughter, and her father's people were exhausted and grieving, and she had always been the kind of woman who carried things quietly rather than put them down where someone else might have to pick them up. She wore the Queen's silver ceremonial gown to the wedding. She stood straight at the altar. She did not tremble when Kellen Blackthorne, tall, dark-eyed, and utterly unreadable, slid a cold ring onto her finger without once looking at her face. She told herself she could survive a cold marriage. She told herself dignity was enough. Then came the garden evenings, those quiet, golden hours when Kellen began to seek her out beneath the open sky, sitting beside her at the stone fountain, as if he had always meant to be there, talking to her in a voice no one else in Veldmore ever used, low and unhurried, like a man with nowhere more important to be. She told herself not to read too much into it. She was wrong about that too. Because then came the night in the east corridor, or the night Jocelyn walked through the dark palace with something precious tucked against her heart, something she had been carrying alone for 3 weeks and had finally decided to share. She raised her hand to knock on her husband's chamber door and heard laughter through the wood. Brielle Nightfall's voice, warm and intimate and entirely at home, asking Kellen when he planned to stop pretending, and Kellen's voice, smooth, unbothered, final. She is a political arrangement. My counsel's solution. Not my choice. Jocelyn lowered her hand. She stood in the dark corridor for exactly as long as it took for that sentence to move from her ears to the place behind her ribs, where all the things she had tried not to hope for were quietly living. Then she walked back to her chamber. She did not run. She did not make a sound. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach, against the secret no one in this palace knew existed, and she made a decision so quietly that the stone walls barely registered it. She was leaving, before dawn, without a word, without a letter, without giving any of them the smallest satisfaction of watching her come apart. By the time the first grey light touched the black towers of Veldmore Palace, her chamber was empty, and the future of the entire kingdom was walking away into the dark, carrying itself with both hands, refusing to look back. Midnight came to Veldmore Palace the way it always did, without announcement and without mercy. Moonlight moved through the high, arched windows of the east wing and laid itself across the stone floors in long silver bars, cold and precise as ruled lines on parchment. The wind outside carried the smell of the pine forests that bordered the palace grounds on 3 sides, deep, resinous, alive with the particular wildness that never fully left the air this close to wolf territory. Somewhere far below in the palace's lower levels, a door closed. A guard changed his post. The soft, rhythmic sound of the night watch, moving through distant corridors, drifted up and then faded, swallowed by the enormous quiet that settled over Veldmore after dark, like a second structure built over the first. It was the kind of silence that had weight, the kind that pressed. Jocelyn Ashbourne stood alone in the east corridor, outside the heavy oak door of her husband's private chamber, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Her feet were bare against the marble floor. She had not stopped to put on shoes. The thin robe she had pulled over her nightgown, when restlessness finally drove her from her bed, offered almost nothing against the chill seeping up from the stone beneath her. But she barely noticed. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, still slightly damp at the ends from the bath she had abandoned an hour ago when sitting still became impossible. She had been standing here for nearly 2 minutes. That was longer than she had planned. She had a speech. She had rehearsed it 3 separate times in the mirror above her dressing table, watching her own reflection, the way you watch someone you are not entirely sure you trust. She had chosen words that were calm and direct and left no room for misinterpretation. She was going to say, "I need to tell you something important, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She had thought the hardest part would be saying the words. She had not accounted for the door. Jocelyn closed her eyes for a moment and let herself stand in the quiet. 4 months. That was how long she had lived inside this palace, walked these corridors, eaten at that enormous table in the great hall under the gaze of a court that had never quite decided how to look at her. 4 months since the wedding. Since the ring. Since the morning she climbed out of a carriage in the outer courtyard and looked up at Veldmore Palace for the first time. All black stone and iron and towers that seemed designed to remind visitors of their own smallness. And thought very clearly, "I have made a terrible mistake." She had not made a sound. She never did. Her father, Elder Ronan Ashbourne, had pressed her hand at the border crossing and looked at her with eyes full of everything he could not bring himself to say. He was a good man, a brave one. He had fought Veldmore's expansion for 2 years with resources that were never going to be sufficient, because he believed in something and was willing to bleed for it. But belief only carries an army so far. And when the last of his border captains fell and the treaty terms landed on his table, there was nothing left in the room except his daughter's face and the particular quality of a man understanding what he is about to ask. She had told him yes before he finished the sentence. "Do not," she had said. "Don't apologize. Just tell me the terms." The Ashbourne bloodline would be spared. Their remaining territories would be returned. Or the displaced families from the eastern settlements would be allowed home. In exchange, the Alpha King of Veldmore would take Jocelyn as his queen, a political binding, a living guarantee that the Ashbournes had accepted the new order. She had packed 2 trunks. She had said goodbye to her mother's grave. She had travelled north for 4 days without crying, because crying required a kind of surrender she was not yet willing to make. The wedding ceremony was brief and precise. Kellen Blackthorne stood at the altar in formal black, his dark eyes fixed somewhere above the assembled court, his expression composed in a way that suggested composure was not a mood for him, but a permanent condition. When he placed the ring on her finger, his touch was careful, almost gentle, actually, which surprised her. But he still did not look at her face. No, she had not expected him to. What followed was 4 months of a marriage that existed entirely on paper. Kellen was not cruel. That was the thing she had not anticipated, because cruelty would have been easier to manage. Cruel people give you something to push against. Kellen gave her nothing. He was polite at the council sessions she attended beside him. He was correct at the formal meals they shared with the court 3 times a week. He acknowledged her presence with brief, measured nods, and asked after her comfort the way a host might ask after a guest, with genuine enough concern and absolutely no personal investment in the answer. He never came to her chamber. She never went to his. Their rooms were connected by a single interior corridor that collected dust undisturbed. Jocelyn had spent the first month learning the palace. She memorized the layout of every floor, the names and roles of the household staff, the rhythms of the kitchen and the guard rotations, and the particular acoustics of the great hall that meant whispers carried in ways people forgot to account for. She attended every ceremony she was required to attend. She smiled with precision, warmly enough to seem genuine, carefully enough not to seem desperate. She went back to her chamber each night alone and told herself it was fine. It was survivable. Then came the garden. She had not been expecting him. That was the thing she came back to, later, when she was trying to understand how she had let her guard down so completely. She had been sitting beside the East Garden fountain on a Wednesday evening in early autumn, reading a book about the migratory patterns of northern wolf packs that she had found in the palace library, and chosen mostly because it was thick enough to occupy a long, empty evening. She heard footsteps on the gravel path. She looked up. Kellen stood at the garden entrance, alone. No council member, no guard detail, no formal occasion requiring his presence. Just a man in the early evening light, in a simple dark shirt, looking at her with an expression she had never seen him use before. Something open and uncertain, and faintly, almost comically, unpracticed. He said, "May I sit?" Not a command, an actual question, addressed to her. She had said yes, mostly out of shock. He sat beside her on the stone bench. He looked at the book in her hands and asked what it was about. She told him. He asked a follow-up question that demonstrated he had actually listened to her answer, which already put him ahead of most of the people she had spoken to in Veldmore. They talked about migratory patterns, and then about the forests beyond the eastern border, and then, somehow, about the particular quality of autumn light in the hour before sunset, and Jocelyn became aware at some point that the light had changed, and that she was no longer holding her book, and that 2 hours had dissolved without her noticing. Kellen stood to leave. He paused at the edge of the path and said, almost to himself, "I forget that it's possible to have a conversation without it requiring something." Then he walked back inside. Jocelyn sat beside the fountain for a while longer in the cooling dark, and tried very firmly not to feel anything about that. Well, she was largely unsuccessful. He came back the next evening, and the one after. Over the 3 weeks that followed, the garden became a place apart from the rest of the palace, outside its protocols, outside its expectations. Kellen talked to her there the way he never talked in the great hall or the council chambers. He was wry occasionally. He was curious about things, genuinely so, in a way that surprised her. He listened when she spoke with a quality of attention she had not experienced from someone in a position of power before, still focused, as if her words were arriving in a place that mattered. Once he laughed at something she said, and looked briefly startled by the sound of it, as if laughter had become unfamiliar enough that its own appearance caught him off guard. But Jocelyn tried very hard to protect herself from what was happening. She built walls. She maintained appropriate distances. She reminded herself, privately and regularly, of all the reasons that trusting this man with anything more than polite conversation was a mistake her future self would not thank her for. She was a political arrangement. She was here because her father lost a war. She was... He had reached across the bench one evening and turned a page in her book that she had been staring at without reading for several minutes, and said, without looking up, "You go quiet when you're trying not to say something. Your whole face changes." And she had said, before she could stop herself, "Does it?" And he had looked at her then, actually looked at her, directly, with those dark eyes that were usually so carefully managed, and said, "It does. I've been trying to figure out what it is you don't say." She had not answered, but she had not moved away either. It was somewhere in that third week that she understood she was in trouble. Real trouble. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already everywhere. She was falling in love with her own husband. She was doing it carefully and completely, and with the particular desperation of someone who knows better and cannot seem to stop. And then, 3 weeks ago, the healer, Veda Ironveil, had confirmed what Jocelyn's body had already been quietly telling her for days. She was pregnant. Kellen's child, the future heir of Veldmore, if such things were still determined by blood and law, or growing inside her while she moved through the palace, keeping secrets and attending ceremonies, and trying to read the face of a man who had spent his whole life learning not to show one. She had told no one. She had carried it alone, and let it settle into her bones slowly, getting used to the weight of it, the particular quality of that specific kind of love that arrives before the person you're going to love is even fully real yet. She had decided, standing in front of her mirror an hour ago, that she could not carry it alone any longer. She was going to tell him. Tonight. Right now. She raised her hand to knock on his chamber door, and heard the laughter. It came through the heavy oak like smoke, effortless, intimate, entirely comfortable. A woman's laugh, low and satisfied, not the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who knows exactly where she stands in a room. Jocelyn's hand went still in the air. She heard Kellen's voice, relaxed in a way she had only heard once before, in the garden, in the evenings, when it was just the two of them, and the fountain and the autumn light. He sounded like a man with his guard completely down, like a man at home. She heard her own name. Brielle Nightfall said it with a particular lightness, the lightness of someone picking up a thing they have already decided to put back down. She said something about the way Jocelyn looked at Kellen during council sessions, and her voice carried the fond amusement of someone watching something predictably foolish unfold. Then she asked, "When are you going to stop pretending, Kellen?" And Kellen said, smooth and easy and completely unbothered, in the voice of a man stating something so obvious it barely required stating, "She is a political arrangement. My council's solution. Not my choice." Jocelyn lowered her hand. The marble floor was very cold beneath her bare feet. She was aware of that now, in a way she hadn't been a moment ago. She was aware of how thin her robe was, and how far she was from her own chamber, and how long the corridor was in both directions. She waited. Some part of her, the part that had built all those careful walls and kept all those careful distances, waited for Kellen to say something else, to qualify, to add something that would shift the meaning of what she had just heard. She waited for him to tell Brielle that she was wrong, or that it was more complicated than that, or that the garden evenings had been. He said nothing. The silence stretched. It was the most complete silence she had ever heard, a silence with edges. Jocelyn stood in the corridor for a moment longer and felt the full weight of what she had allowed herself to hope for. And then she set it down, very carefully, very quietly. She turned around. She walked back to her chamber on feet that felt like borrowed things, borrowed from some version of herself who had not yet heard that sentence, who was still standing at the fountain in the autumn light thinking she might be loved. She walked through the long corridor without making a sound, without looking at the walls or the windows or the moonlight lying cold and indifferent across the floor. She pressed one palm flat against her stomach as she walked. Just once, just briefly, and then she made a decision. She was leaving. Before dawn, without a word, without a letter, without giving this palace or this king or that laughing woman behind that door the smallest piece of her visible grief. She had arrived here without being asked. She would leave the same way. Inside her chamber, Jocelyn moved in the dark without lighting a lamp. She did not need one. She had learned this room the way she learned everything, thoroughly, in case she ever needed to find her way through it, blind. She pulled her mother Leora's old traveling cloak from the back of the wardrobe. It was worn soft at the elbows and smelled faintly of the lavender her mother had always kept in the cedar chest. She pressed her face into it for exactly 1 second. Then she put it on. She opened the small locked box on her dressing table where she kept the gold coins she had quietly set aside over 4 months. A small habit born from the instinct of a woman who had always understood that having options required preparation. She took the knife from the bedside drawer. She gathered dried provisions from her personal stores, enough for several days. She opened the jewelry box. The Queen's silver ceremonial necklace lay inside on a bed of dark velvet. Heavy, formal. The visible mark of everything she was in this palace. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed the box, leaving the necklace inside. She was not taking that. She had not earned it honestly, and she would not carry it dishonestly. Or from the small table beside the window, she took the only piece of jewelry she actually wanted. A simple chain with a small carved pendant her mother had pressed into her hand the morning she left home. A wolf, carved from pale river stone, worn smooth from years of handling. Her mother had said, "No matter what they call you there, remember your own name first." Jocelyn fastened the chain around her neck, pulled the hood of the traveling cloak up over her hair, and picked up her bag. She looked around the chamber one last time. The expensive furniture, the silk bedding, the perfectly arranged dressing table, everything tasteful and cold and utterly impersonal, like a room assembled to suggest the presence of a person rather than actually contain one. She looked at the window that faced the east garden. From here, on clear evenings, she could see the stone fountain. She made herself look away. Then she opened the chamber door and walked out into the dark corridor, and she did not look back, and she did not make a sound, and the palace breathed its cold, indifferent breath around her as she moved through it toward the outer gates. The East Gate guard on duty that night was Coulter Ravencrest. He was young, 23, maybe 24, with an open, honest face that had not yet learned to arrange itself into the careful neutrality the older guards wore like a second uniform. He had been on the night rotation for 6 weeks. Jocelyn had learned his name in the 2nd month because she had made a habit of learning the names of the people who stood in the cold so that others could feel safe. She pulled her hood lower as she approached the gate. He saw her anyway. Of course he did. He was a wolf, and wolves saw things in the dark. For a moment, 3 full seconds, she counted them, Coulter Ravencrest stood very still. She watched him work through it. The recognition, the confusion, the calculation. He looked at her traveling cloak and her bag and the careful, composed set of her face, and she could see him understanding something he clearly had not expected to understand tonight. Then he stepped aside. "Safe roads, my queen," he said, very quietly, as if the words were meant only for the space between them and nowhere else. Jocelyn nodded once. She walked through the gate and did not look back. The palace road curved away behind her, and then the trees closed in on either side, the great pine forest that bordered Veldmore's northern grounds. And the palace disappeared from view, and Jocelyn was alone in a way she had not been since before the war ended. She walked for an hour before she allowed herself to stop. The cave she found was shallow and dry, carved into a rocky outcropping a few miles north of the palace boundary. She checked it carefully before entering. Old habit from childhood summers in the Ashbourne Hill country, where her mother had insisted she learn the practical things alongside the ceremonial ones. Empty. Clean. Defensible from one direction only, which was not ideal, but better than open ground. She did not make a fire. Too visible. She sat with her back against the cave wall and pulled the cloak around herself and listened to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythms. Owl. Wind. The distant, the occasional sound of large animals moving through the trees with the unhurried confidence of things that belonged here. She was not afraid of the dark. She had never been afraid of the dark. It was the illuminated things that had always done the real damage. For a while she simply sat. And then, because the silence was very complete and the child inside her was very real, Jocelyn began to talk. Not loudly. Not even quite aloud. Just under her breath, in the particular register of someone sharing a confidence with another person who is very close. "We're outside the palace," she said. "I know it's cold. I'm sorry about that. It will be warmer soon. I'll find somewhere better tomorrow, I promise." The baby could not hear her. She knew that. The pregnancy was not yet far enough along for any of that. But talking to it felt necessary in a way she did not try to explain to herself, because some things are true, regardless of whether they can be explained. "You're going to be fine," she said. "We both are. I need you to know that, even if you can't hear me yet. I need to say it to someone." She pressed her hand against her stomach. Still flat. Still a secret from the outside world. "I don't know exactly where we're going," she continued, "but I know what we're going away from. And I know it was the right choice. You are not going to grow up being told you were an arrangement. You're not going to grow up watching your mother smile at people who don't see her. I'm not going to let that be your first lesson about the world." The wind moved through the trees outside the cave and made a sound that was almost like a voice, almost like agreement. Jocelyn sat with her back against the rock and felt, beneath the exhaustion and the grief and the cold, something she had not expected to feel tonight. Relief. Not happiness. Not peace. But the specific, clean feeling of having finally put down something very heavy that you have been carrying for a long time in a way that was slowly, quietly hurting you. She had been performing contentment in that palace for 4 months. She had been performing adequacy and gratitude and the particular composed grace of a woman who has accepted her circumstances. It had taken so much energy. She had not fully realized how much until this moment, sitting in a cold cave in the dark with nothing to perform for and no one to perform it to. She was just herself. Just Jocelyn, tired and heartbroken, and pregnant and free. She slept eventually, or in fits, light and alert, the way her body had always handled unfamiliar environments. She woke before dawn, assessed the situation with clear eyes, ate a small amount from her provisions, and continued north. The abandoned groundskeeper's cottage she found on the second day was not much to look at. It leaned very slightly to the left, as if it had been tired for a long time and had decided leaning was better than falling. The roof was intact over the main room, less certain over what had probably once been a storage area at the back. The door hung properly on its hinges. A small stone fireplace occupied one wall, the chimney intact, if dusty, a rusted iron hook above the fireplace, a wooden shelf along the opposite wall, partially collapsed at one end. Jocelyn walked through the 2 rooms carefully, checking the floor for rot, testing the walls for stability, examining the window frames for gaps that would need to be filled before the temperature dropped further. Then she set down her bag. "This will do," she said. "Not to anyone. Just to the air. Just to make it official." She spent the rest of that day working. She swept first, because order matters more when everything else is uncertain. It is harder to despair in a clean space. She repaired the collapsed end of the shelf using pieces of wood she found stacked against the exterior wall, held together with strips of cloth torn from the worn shirt she had packed as a sleep layer. She filled the gaps in the window frames with dried moss, pressed tightly into the cracks. She gathered firewood from the forest floor, dry pieces from under the canopy where the rain hadn't reached, and built a careful, but efficient fire that caught cleanly and threw warmth into the room within minutes. By evening, the cottage was livable. Not comfortable. Not beautiful. But hers. In the days that followed, Jocelyn built a life from the materials available to her. She hunted with the small knife she had brought, using traps she constructed from bent wood and twisted cord, checking them each morning in the blue hour before full dawn. She gathered edible plants from the forest. Her mother had made sure she knew which ones, storing roots in the cool shadows under the back wall and hanging herbs from the iron hook above the fireplace. She found a stream 1/2 mile east that ran clean and cold, and established a route to it that avoided the most open ground. She reinforced the door with a heavy branch wedged at an angle inside. She created a small alarm system around the perimeter of the cottage using lengths of cord strung between trees at ankle height, attached to a collection of small stones that would clatter against each other if disturbed. Simple. Effective. The kind of thing her mother had shown her once, on a camping trip in the hill country, laughing as she demonstrated, saying, "You're a wolf's daughter, Jocelyn. Always know if something's coming." She was a wolf's daughter. She had perhaps forgotten that, somewhere in 4 months of marble floors and formal dinners. She was remembering now. The baby made itself known more insistently as the days passed. Not dramatically, just consistently, a deepening physical reality that Jocelyn's body kept announcing in small, unmistakable ways. The particular fatigue of the early months, or the heightened sharpness of smell that made the pine forest almost overwhelmingly vivid. The hunger that arrived suddenly and completely like a tap turned on several times a day. She fed herself carefully, methodically. Not because she was hungry for herself. Grief had done something complicated to her appetite. But because the baby needed it, and the baby's needs had become the most organizing principle of her days. One afternoon, near the end of her 2nd week in the cottage, Jocelyn was sitting outside on the narrow step at the front door, mending a tear in her cloak with a bone needle and thread she had found in the cottage's one small drawer when she felt it. A flutter. So faint she almost mistook it for something else. A shift in the air, a trick of her own heartbeat. Then it happened again. Her hands went still on the cloak, or she sat without moving, barely breathing, and waited. It happened a 3rd time, unmistakably. Something that was not her, separate and small and insistently present, making itself known. Jocelyn set the cloak down very carefully on the step beside her. She pressed both hands against her stomach. Her eyes filled, not with sadness, not with the kind of tears that had been waiting since the corridor outside Kellen's chamber, but with something else entirely. Something warm and enormous and surprised. "Hello," she whispered. The flutter came once more, as if in answer, and Jocelyn, who had not cried once since leaving Veldmore Palace, sat on the crooked step of a leaning cottage in the middle of the outer territories and laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and let a few tears fall with it, and felt, for the first time since that corridor, that the future was not something to endure, but something to move toward. "I've been waiting to meet you," she said softly. "Not long now. We have some things to figure out first, you and I. But we'll get there." She picked up the cloak and went back to her mending. 3 days later, she met Sienna Darkmoor. The herb trader appeared at the edge of the nearest human settlement, a cluster of cottages an hour's walk from Jocelyn's, with a cart loaded with bundled dried plants and small glass bottles, and the particular efficient energy of someone whose entire life had been organized around moving from one place to another. She was somewhere in her 40s, with weathered hands and bright, matter-of-fact eyes that assessed Jocelyn in one quick sweep and apparently concluded that no explanation was required. Or she sold Jocelyn ginger root, dried lavender, rosehip, and a small jar of something she described only as helpful for the second trimester. Trust me. She told Jocelyn that the bloat in her face would ease by the 5th month. She told her that ginger root in hot water 3 times a day would help with the remaining nausea. She asked no questions about where Jocelyn came from, or where she was going, or why a clearly well-born woman was buying survival herbs in the outer territories with the careful movements of someone who did not want to be noticed. As Jocelyn turned to leave, Sienna said, "You're doing well, you know. Whatever it is." Jocelyn paused. "Whatever what is?" "Whatever it is you're managing on your own," Sienna said. "You're doing well at it." She shrugged, was as if this were a simple observation, and not the thing that would stay with Jocelyn for the rest of the week. Just thought someone should say so. Jocelyn walked back to the cottage with her herbs and her ginger root, and the strange, specific warmth of having been seen by a stranger at exactly the right moment, and she thought about her mother, who had always been the one to say the things that most people thought but did not bother to say. She hung the lavender above the fireplace beside the drying rosehip. The cottage smelled almost like home. Kellen Blackthorne did not sleep late. In 6 years of ruling Veldmoor, he had not once allowed himself the indulgence of sleeping past dawn. The day had demands that began at first light, and did not pause for the preferences of the man responsible for meeting them. He was awake before the sky fully committed to blue, dressed without requiring assistance, and at his desk with the morning's first reports before his household staff had finished lighting the corridor lamps. This was who he was. Consistent, controlled, reliable in the way that machinery is reliable, through the consistent suppression of everything that might cause variation. Which was why, when Cade Stormrider appeared in his study doorway at the early hour of the morning, with an expression that didn't match the calm routine of a regular report, Kellen noticed immediately. Cade was his head guard, had been for 4 years. He was a compact, methodical man who communicated primarily through the precise calibration of his facial expressions. A slight tightening around the eyes meant concern. A barely perceptible shift in his jaw meant something requiring immediate attention. Right now his jaw was set at an angle Kellen had only seen twice before, and neither occasion had been minor. "The Queen did not sleep in her chamber last night," Cade said. Kellen set down the report he was holding. He said, "What?" Mira, her morning attendant, arrived at the usual time. The chamber was empty. The bed had been slept in, but not fully. She believes the Queen rose sometime well before dawn. Coulter Ravencrest reports that the Queen passed through the east gate on foot, alone, carrying a bag, sometime in the hours before first light. He did not stop her. The words arrived in Kellen's mind in a sequence that his composure handled perfectly, and his chest did not handle at all. He stood, but he walked to Jocelyn's chamber without stopping to arrange his expression. The door was unlocked. The room was exactly as it always appeared from the doorway, impeccably arranged, every surface in its correct position. Bed made, furniture in place, the silk curtains drawn back from the window in the way the morning staff would have left them. He stepped inside. He stood in the center of the room and looked at it the way he had never bothered to look at it before. Not as a functional space that housed a political necessity, but as a place where a person had been living. Really living, in the small, particular ways that people leave evidence of themselves in the spaces they inhabit. The book on the nightstand, a study of northern wolf migration patterns. A folded letter from her father, kept not locked away but resting flat on the desk, or as if consulted often. A small crescent of dried lavender on the window ledge, probably gathered from the palace gardens. He went to the dressing table. The Queen's silver ceremonial necklace lay in the open jewelry box on a velvet bed, unlatched, as if placed there deliberately rather than forgotten. It caught the morning light. Kellen picked it up. It was heavy. He had not touched it since the wedding, when a court official had presented it as part of the formal binding. He had not thought much about it since. It was a ceremonial object, a symbol. Jocelyn wore it to official occasions. He had registered its presence the way he registered most things about Jocelyn for the first several months. Peripherally, carefully, from the managed distance he had decided was necessary. He stood in her chamber holding the necklace, and the managed distance collapsed entirely. He put the necklace down. "Send for the council," he told Cade, who had appeared silently in the doorway, "and send for Veda Ironvale. Tell her I need to speak with her privately before the council session." "Yes, Alpha King." "And Cade." Kellen looked at him. "Coulter Ravencrest, did he say anything about the Queen's condition when she passed through the gate?" Cade was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was choosing words. He said she appeared composed. He also said, another pause. He said she had been crying. He described it as silent. He seemed to feel it was important to make that distinction. Kellen looked at the window that faced the east garden. The fountain was visible from here, he realized. He had never noticed that before. "Thank you," he said. "That will be all." But the council assembled in the great hall within the hour. 5 members, arranged in their customary order along the table, with the careful expressions of people who have been given incomplete information and are managing their response to it accordingly. Elder Blaise Wintermere, Trenton Stoneheart, Marlowe Frostvale, Arden Darkmoor, and Riker Ironvale, who served as the council's senior territorial advisor and had always regarded Jocelyn with the specific neutrality of someone who had decided she was irrelevant. Blaise spoke first, as he usually did. "We understand the Queen has departed the palace grounds." His voice was measured, neutral in the way that was not actually neutral. "This is, of course, an unexpected development. However, it may present an opportunity to reassess certain arrangements that the Council has felt, for some time, to Stop. The single word landed in the hall with the weight of something considerably larger. Every face turned to Kellen. He was standing at the head of the table, and he was looking at Blaise Wintermere with an expression that communicated, without any possibility of misinterpretation, that the sentence he had been about to finish was not going to be finished. Blaise stopped. The hall was very quiet. "My wife is missing," Kellen said. "I want search teams organized by midday. Discreet ones. I do not want the outer territories flooded with palace wolves that will frighten her further from the grounds. I want a sweep of every settlement within 2 days' travel, north and east. And I want to know," he said, his voice dropping to something quieter and considerably more dangerous, "who saw her leave this palace and what was said to her in the hours before she went." He let that last sentence sit in the air. Nobody spoke. "Good," Kellen said. "Then we understand each other." He dismissed the council and went to find Veda Ironvale. The palace healer was a small, precise woman with silver-threaded hair and the particular quality of stillness that distinguished people who spent their professional lives in the presence of pain. She had served the Blackthorn Palace for 14 years. She met Kellen in her private workroom with the composure of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had been preparing for it. She told him directly. She did not require prompting. The Queen visited me 3 weeks ago. She asked me to confirm a pregnancy. I did. She is approximately 6 weeks along, Alpha King, or she requested that I tell no one, and I honored that request as long as I could. I am telling you now because I believe her safety requires it. The word landed on Kellen in the complete silence of Vader's workroom, and he sat down in the chair beside the examination table without deciding to. His body simply made the decision without consulting him. Pregnant. Jocelyn was pregnant. She had been carrying this for 3 weeks, walking through this palace with it tucked inside her like a secret that was also a responsibility, attending his council sessions, eating his formal meals, sitting beside him in the garden in the evenings, carrying his child and telling no one, and then disappearing into the dark before dawn. He thought about the corridor outside his chamber. He thought about Betrayal. He thought about what Jocelyn would have heard if she had been standing in that corridor at the wrong moment. His throat went very tight. Did she indicate any reason for concern? He asked. Any complication with the pregnancy? None, Vader said. She was well. Careful about it. Already asking sensible questions about what she would need to eat, how to manage the fatigue. Already preparing, Kellen said, mostly to himself. She struck me as a woman who prepares for things, Vader said. There was something in her voice. Not quite reproach, not quite pity. Something that sat between them without requiring acknowledgement. Kellen stood. Thank you, Vader, for telling her the truth and for telling me. Find her, Alpha King, Vader said. She should not be out there alone. He went directly from the healer's workroom to Betrayal Nightfall's office. Betrayal was at her desk when he entered, reviewing territorial correspondence with the efficient focus of a woman who had organized her professional life around being indispensable. She looked up at his entrance with an expression of appropriate concern, calibrated precisely, he now recognized, to suggest just enough worry without revealing anything underneath it. I've been hearing about the search efforts, she said. I've already begun reviewing the patrol routes to identify. Who was in my private chamber last night? Kellen asked. Betrayal met his eyes without flinching. I was. We had our regular evening review of the Northern Territorial dispatches. You'll recall we discussed the Frostvale border markers. I remember. Kellen moved to stand in front of her desk. He did not sit. And I also remember a conversation that went considerably further than territorial dispatches. A conversation about my wife. Something moved through Betrayal's expression. Very small, very fast. If he had not been specifically looking for it, he would have missed it entirely. We spoke candidly about the political realities of your marriage, she said, as we have always done. I consider candid counsel to be the primary value I bring to. Was the Queen in the corridor, Kellen said, when that candid counsel was being given? The pause was a fraction of a second too long. I had no way of knowing. That is not what I asked. Betrayal was quiet. Kellen looked at her, really looked at her, with the same quality of attention he had learned in the garden evenings, the kind that did not stop at the surface, and understood, and with a clarity that arrived all at once and left no room for doubt, exactly what had happened. She had known. She had steered the conversation deliberately to that moment. She had heard or sensed Jocelyn's approach and had chosen her words accordingly, because she had understood, as she always understood the mechanics of situations, that Kellen's unguarded response, his default deflection to political language, would read to Jocelyn as confirmation of everything she feared. She had engineered it. She had taken the most honest thing in Kellen's life, those garden evenings, that tentative, genuinely felt opening toward his wife, and she had used it against both of them. "How long?" Kellen said very quietly. "Have you been working toward this?" Brielle straightened. When she spoke again, the calibrated concern was gone entirely. But what replaced it was something older and more settled. The conviction of someone who has told themselves a story for long enough that it has become the truth they live in. "Since the day your father introduced you to me," she said. "Since the day I understood what you were and decided to dedicate my abilities to this kingdom. I have served you for 12 years, Kellen. I have been at your right hand through every crisis, every territorial challenge, every impossible decision. I have given this kingdom more than most people give anything." And then a council of old men decided that a defeated elder's daughter would serve better as your queen than the person who has been standing beside you all along. You manipulated my wife out of her own home. I protected this kingdom from an alpha who was losing his judgment over a treaty bride. Well, she's carrying my child. The silence that followed that sentence was different from all the previous silences. It had a different texture. Even Brielle's composure, which had held through everything else, shifted slightly. Something crossing her face that was neither guilt nor triumph, but something more complicated than either. "I didn't know that," she said, and for the first time she sounded like she meant something. "No," Kellen said, "you didn't, because you were so certain you understood the situation completely that you did not consider what you might be missing." He stepped back from the desk. His voice had gone very quiet, very final. "You are relieved of every title and position you hold in this palace. You are banished from Veldmore's territories, effective immediately. You will be escorted to the border by this evening." "Oh, Kellen, do not," he said, and his voice did not rise, and it did not need to. "Do not say my name in that tone again. You have forfeited that." He walked out of the office and closed the door behind him, and he stood in the corridor for a moment with his eyes closed, and he was not angry. Or rather, the anger was there. But underneath it was something larger and more urgent, something that had been building since he picked up that ceremonial necklace from Jocelyn's dressing table and felt its weight in his palm and understood exactly what it meant that she had left it behind. He went back to his own chambers. He packed the way he had watched soldiers pack before long deployments, lean and practical, only what was necessary, nothing that would slow him down. He chose clothes that could pass without notice in the outer territories. He took his knife, not the ceremonial blade, but the simple, working one he had carried since he was 17. Provisions for a week, a compass, a small lamp. He went to find Cade. "I'm leaving the palace," he said. "I'm going to find Jocelyn myself." Cade absorbed this without visible surprise. "You want a full search party?" "No. You and 2 guards. No palace colors, no formal markings. I don't want to frighten her further before I can reach her." "Understood." Cade paused. "The council will not be pleased." "The council," Kellen said, pulling on his traveling coat, "can manage themselves for a while. Riker Ironvale will hold the administrative duties in my absence. Tell them I will return when I have my queen. Tell them that is not a negotiable timeline." He walked through the palace gates on foot, without ceremony, without announcement, to in the mid-morning light of an ordinary day. He did not look back. He had spent 6 years building a kingdom from the inside of its walls. He was beginning to understand, at considerable cost, that some things could only be built from wherever you actually were. The days in the outer territories had a different quality than the days inside the palace. Inside the palace, time was structured by obligation, council sessions that began at fixed hours, formal meals that demanded presence at specific times, ceremonies that unfolded according to schedules set months in advance. Time inside the palace was never yours. It belonged to the role. Out here, time belonged to the work, and the work was simple and physical and completely honest. Jocelyn woke each morning in the grey hour before full light, when the birds were just beginning, and the forest had that particular damp green smell of night releasing its hold on things. She rebuilt the fire from banked coals, heated water, drank ginger root tea, standing at the single window looking out at the trees. She checked her perimeter alarms. The cord and stone system she had improved twice in 2 weeks, extending it further from the cottage and raising the trip lines to a height that would catch a wolf moving at speed in the dark. She checked her traps. Then she worked. She had added to the cottage, not dramatically, but usefully. A second shelf built from fallen timber, properly leveled this time. A hook beside the door for her cloak. A wooden latch on the inside of the shutters that could be thrown quickly from across the room if she needed to seal the window fast. Small improvements, was accumulated daily, that added up to something that felt increasingly like intention. The cradle she built in the 3rd week was the most complex thing she attempted. She found the right wood, 3 days of searching. A fallen oak branch, well-dried and dense, with a natural curve that she recognized as close to what she needed. She worked on it in the evenings by firelight, shaping the wood with the knife and a sharp-edged stone she had found at the stream. It took 4 evenings. It was not elegant. The joints were not perfectly smooth, and it rocked slightly unevenly on the cottage floor. She looked at it for a long time when it was finished. Then she lined it with the rabbit fur she had cured over the previous week and folded the lining neatly into place. And she thought, "This is the first thing I have made in my life that was made entirely out of love and nothing else." That felt like something worth noting. The baby's movements had become a regular presence now. Not constant. There were hours of quiet, but reliable enough that Jocelyn had begun to notice patterns. More active in the evenings, quiet and still in the late mornings, a particular kind of flutter when she was outside in the fresh air that she had decided to interpret as enthusiasm for the forest. "You're going to love it out here," she told the baby one afternoon while she was walking her trap line through the trees. "It smells like everything's alive. It never smells like that inside stone walls. You'll understand the difference when you're old enough to walk outside by yourself." Or she talked to the baby the way some people talk to the sky, without expectation, without urgency, just because it was necessary. It organized her thinking. It gave the solitude a shape. There was a night in the 4th week when the shape of the solitude became less manageable. The wind came in from the north and drove rain sideways against the cottage shutters in a way that made them rattle in a persistent, uneven rhythm that was just annoying enough to keep sleep away. The fire burned low, and she let it. She was conserving wood for the colder weeks ahead. She lay on the narrow bed, under both blankets, with her knees pulled up and listened to the rain and thought about the east garden. She thought about the particular quality of the light there in the hour before sunset. That specific amber gold that made the stone of the fountain look almost warm. She thought about the sound of the water. She thought about Kellen saying, almost to himself, "I forget that it's possible to have a conversation without it requiring something." She had replayed that sentence many times in the week since the corridor. She was never quite sure whether to be furious at it or heartbroken by it. It was the sentence of a genuinely lonely person, not a calculating one. She had heard the real thing underneath it, the way truth sometimes escaped through gaps in controlled language before the speaker could catch it. She thought about his silence in the corridor, the specific, complete silence, when Brielle asked if it was real. She thought about the fact that silence was not always the same as an answer. And then she stopped herself. Firmly, because that was exactly the kind of thinking that would undo her, the careful reconstruction of ambiguous moments into something she could convince herself was hope, when hope was the most dangerous thing she could afford right now. She got up and put more wood on the fire and made a second cup of ginger tea and sat in the firelight until the rain shifted direction and the shutters stopped rattling, and then she went back to sleep. The rogue wolves came 2 nights later. She heard the perimeter alarm first, the soft, small sound of pebbles clicking together, once and then again. She was awake before the echo finished, sitting upright in the dark, listening. Silence. Then another click from the far side of the perimeter. Something moving at a careful pace, testing the ground. 2 sources. Possibly 3. Jocelyn was out of the bed and across the room in the dark, the knife in her hand, the shutter latch thrown before the next click came. She pressed against the wall beside the window and listened to the forest. 3 of them, moving in a loose pattern around the cottage that spoke of familiarity with this kind of approach, testing for exits, assessing the structure, communicating in the wordless way of wolves who hunted together regularly. Rogues. The outer territories had several loose groups, wolves who lived outside pack structure and supplemented whatever resources they could gather from what the unprotected territories offered. They were not, generally, violent without a reason, but a lone occupant in a defensible cottage represented resources worth investigating. Jocelyn did not move. She stood beside the shuttered window with the knife and the silence and the specific, clarifying quality of fear that arrived not as panic, but as sharpened attention. Every sense dialed up, every muscle ready. The footsteps circled. They tried the door. A single push against it, testing the resistance of the latch. The latch held. Another push. Still held. There was a low exchange of voices outside, too quiet for full words, but carrying the tone of a brief negotiation. Then the footsteps retreated. Not far. Jocelyn tracked them to the edge of the tree line, where they stopped. Waiting. Deciding. She stayed beside the window for 2 full hours. At some point, well past midnight, the footsteps moved again. Away this time. Fully away, the sound diminishing into the forest until the trees absorbed it entirely. She waited another 30 minutes before she moved. Then she sat on the floor of the cottage with her back against the bed frame and her knees pulled up and her hand flat against her stomach, and she breathed slowly and deliberately until her heartbeat settled. "That was difficult," she said quietly to the baby, "but we're fine. They're gone." The latch held. She added 3 additional reinforcements to the door the next morning. She extended the perimeter alarm by another 10 yards in every direction. She spent the afternoon thinking carefully about what other improvements could be made with available materials, and she made a list on a piece of bark with a charred stick, and she worked through it systematically over the following days. She was getting better at this. She was, she realized with some surprise, genuinely good at this, or she had arrived in Veldmore and spent 4 months suppressing everything capable about herself in order to fit the narrow space the palace had designated for its political queen. Out here, with nothing to suppress herself for, she was discovering the shape of what she actually was. She could build. She could hunt. She could make a plan and execute it, and adjust when the plan required adjustment. She could walk into a cold cave in the dark with a baby growing inside her and decide to keep going. Whoever had decided she was nothing more than a useful arrangement had made their assessment with remarkably incomplete information. Kellen tracked Jocelyn's trail the way his wolf had been trained since boyhood, low to the ground, patient, reading the signs that human attention tended to miss. A heel print in soft earth near a stream crossing. The particular angle at which a branch had been bent and not snapped, suggesting someone moving carefully, conserving their impact on the environment. The faint, fading thread of a familiar scent on still air that made his wolf rise with something urgent and certain. She was moving north and east. She was staying off the main paths. She was doing everything correctly for someone who wanted to disappear. He found the cave on the second day. Cold ash, barely visible in the rock. A single, shallow impression in the earth where she had sat with her back against the wall. The smell of her, something warm and specific that he had learned in the garden evenings and had apparently stored in some part of himself that the managed distance had not managed to reach. Faint but undeniable. She had been here. She had slept here in the cold, alone, the first night. Kellen crouched in the entrance of the cave and looked at the cold ash and the heel impression and the faint trace of her presence, and he felt something in his chest that his composure could not process and did not try to. "She was here 2 nights ago," Cade said from behind him. "Moving well, tracking consistently northeast. She knows how to move through this kind of terrain," Kellen said. "She was trained by someone who cared about her surviving difficult conditions," Cade observed. His tone was entirely neutral. Kellen stood and continued north. They moved through the territories for 4 days. The scent trail grew gradually stronger, which meant they were closing the distance. Not because Jocelyn was slowing down, but because they were moving faster and more directly than she had, without the need for caution or concealment. On the 5th day, Cade located boot prints near a settlement on the outer edge of the territories. A local trader, when approached with careful questioning, mentioned selling ginger root and dried herbs to a quiet, dark-haired young woman who had not offered her name. She had paid in good gold coin. She had asked sensible questions about the herbs she was buying. "She's preparing," Kellen said. "She's been preparing since she left," Cade said. "Everything we've tracked suggests someone who thinks clearly under pressure." "I know," Kellen said. And there was something in those 2 words, a weight, a recognition, that Cade heard but did not comment on. It was on the 6th day that Cade identified the cottage. Smoke, visible above the tree line at a distance, but carefully controlled, small enough to avoid drawing attention, consistent enough to suggest an established occupant. They approached from downwind, moving slowly, and Kellen scented her from 300 yards, real and close and alive, and his wolf went very still with relief. He signaled to Cade and the guards to hold position. Then he heard the other scents, 3 rogues circling the cottage from the south, moving with the focused patience of wolves who had a target and were not in a hurry about it. Their pattern was unmistakable. This was not a casual investigation. They were assessing the structure methodically, looking for points of vulnerability. Kellen felt the shift inside himself happen before he had fully decided anything. The specific, the clean quality of an alpha wolf who has identified a threat to something that matters and has moved past the evaluation stage entirely. He moved through the trees at a pace that made no sound. He came through the trees at a run. The 3 rogues were positioned around the cottage in a loose triangle, one at the door, one near the east-facing window, one circling back from the south. The door was barricaded from inside. The shutters were latched, and standing in the gap of the doorway, having pulled the latch and opened the door a single foot, was Jocelyn. She had a knife. She was holding it with the grip of someone who had learned correctly. Thumb along the spine, blade angled out, weight shifted forward onto her front foot. She was pale and her jaw was set, and her eyes were doing the thing they did when she had already decided something and was simply waiting for events to catch up to her decision. She was protecting her home. She was not going to move. Kellen placed himself between Jocelyn and the nearest rogue before the rogue had finished turning. He did not raise his voice. He looked at all three of them in a single, slow sweep and said, "Walk away." The lead rogue, a broad-shouldered man with the cautious eyes of someone who had survived the outer territories long enough to be good at reading situations, looked at Kellen and performed his own assessment. He arrived at his conclusion in approximately 4 seconds. "Who hired you?" Kellen asked. A pause. "We received payment from a female wolf out of the Northern Palace territory. Dark-haired, high-standing. And your instructions?" The rogue's jaw tightened. "Find the pregnant woman. Make sure she didn't go back." The specific quality of the silence that followed that statement was something Kellen would remember for a very long time. "Leave," he said. "If I see any of you within 2 days' travel of this location again, I will not ask questions first." They left. He stood in the clearing and listened to their footsteps diminish into the forest until the trees absorbed them completely. Then he turned around. Jocelyn was still standing in the doorway. She had lowered the knife. She had not put it away. She was looking at him with an expression he could not immediately read. Not the composed neutrality she wore in the palace, but something more alive and more careful than that. The look of a person making a real-time assessment of something that mattered. He said her name. It came out differently than he intended. He had been preparing to speak carefully, to organize his words the way he organized everything, in advance, with intention, leaving nothing to chance. But her name left his mouth with all the preparation stripped out of it, and what remained was just the sound of something he had been carrying for weeks and was only now setting down. She said, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because you left." "I left because I heard you." Her voice was steady. She had been rehearsing this, he realized, or not rehearsing exactly, but she had spent weeks living with what she heard, turning it over, understanding it from every angle, and now she was presenting it the way she had learned to present difficult things. Clearly, or without embellishment. "I heard exactly what you said. I heard you tell her that I was a political arrangement. Your council's solution. Not your choice." "I know. Then you understand why." "I was lying." The words came out very simply. Kellen moved to the edge of the clearing, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to give her the space the moment required. "Not to you," he said. "To Brielle. I have been lying to Brielle, and to the council, and to myself, since the first garden evening. Since you told me about the wolf migration patterns, and I stayed for 2 hours when I meant to stay for 20 minutes, and walked back inside afterward, thinking about a conversation for the first time in years." He paused. "Brielle staged that conversation. She knew you were in the corridor. She directed what I said, because she understood that my default response, falling back on political language, deflecting to the council's framing, would land on you as confirmation of everything you feared. She used my habit against both of us." Jocelyn was quiet. "I know that doesn't fix what you heard," he continued. "I know the words existed, regardless of what she intended, by putting them in front of you. The truth is that I have said that sentence before, to the council, to myself, in the first months, because I thought maintaining that framing would keep me functional and keep the kingdom steady and keep me from making decisions based on—" He stopped. Then he started again. "Based on caring about you," he said, "which I had already started doing before I had a name for it." Those evenings, Jocelyn. All of it. None of that was performance. I need you to know that, because I need it to be true between us, regardless of what happens next. Jocelyn took a breath, slow and deliberate, the way she breathed when she was thinking, very carefully. Brielle, she said, is she still in the palace? No. She is banished from Veldmore's territories. When I understood what she had done, I stripped her of every position she held and sent her to the border. That happened the day before I left to find you. Something moved through Jocelyn's expression. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but the specific easing of a tension she had been holding. Why did you come yourself? She asked. You're the Alpha King. You have people for this. Because sending someone else, Kellen said, was not something I was willing to do. He looked at her directly. You left because of me. I needed to be the one to come. Well, not because it was strategically correct, because it was the only right thing. Jocelyn looked at him for a long time. Kellen let her look. He had nothing left to manage or conceal. Whatever she saw in his face, she was seeing the actual thing, and that was going to have to be enough. I need to tell you something, Jocelyn said. All right. She straightened. She looked at him with the direct, clear-eyed steadiness that he had recognized from the very first garden evening as one of her most distinctive qualities, a woman who delivered important information with both hands on the table. I'm pregnant, she said. 6 weeks, approximately. Vader confirmed it before I left. I was coming to your chamber that night to tell you. That is why I was in the corridor. The clearing was very quiet. Kellen crossed it in 4 steps and held her. And not with ceremony, not with calculation, not with the careful management of physical contact that the palace had always seemed to require. He held her the way you hold something you have just narrowly prevented yourself from losing, with the specific quality of a person who understands, in their bones, that they will spend the rest of their life ensuring this never comes close to happening again. Jocelyn's free hand went to the front of his coat, gripping the fabric. She did not cry, but her forehead dropped against his shoulder, and she let her weight rest against him for the first time, and he felt her exhale, long and slow and enormous, the release of something she had been carrying since before dawn on the day she left. They stood in the clearing, while the light moved through the trees in the slow, or indifferent way of light that has no opinion about human matters. After a while, Jocelyn pulled back just enough to look at him. I'm not going back as a political arrangement, she said. I won't do that again. You're going back as my mate, Kellen said, and as the mother of my heir, and as the person who, in the weeks since she left, has apparently built a surveillance perimeter, a functioning food storage system, and a handmade cradle, which I observed through the cottage door and which is genuinely impressive for someone working without tools. Jocelyn blinked. Something shifted in her expression. Still careful, still assessing, but with the very beginning of something warmer moving under it. The joints aren't perfect, she said. No, he agreed. But it exists. Most things worth anything have imperfect joints. She looked at him. He looked back. I need you to mean it, she said quietly. Everything you've said. I need it to be the thing you keep choosing, not just the thing you said today when circumstances required it. I know, he said, and I will spend however long it takes proving that I mean it. Every day. That is not a promise I'm making because I have to. It is a promise I'm making because it is the first thing I have ever wanted to promise. The knife was still in her hand. She looked down at it. Then she folded it closed and put it in her coat pocket. Then take me home, she said. But we're doing things differently. Yes, Kellen said. We are. They arrived at Veldmore Palace 3 days later, on a clear morning in the middle of the week, when the light had that particular, clean quality that belonged to autumn on the edge of winter. Dr. Kellen had sent no announcement ahead. He had not orchestrated a formal reception or arranged for the court to be assembled. He had simply sent Cade forward with a single message for Riker Ironvale. Prepare the Great Hall. Nothing more. He walked through the palace gates beside Jocelyn, with his hand in hers, not because ceremony demanded it, but because she had taken his hand somewhere on the second day of travel, and neither of them had let go since, and he had no intention of being the one who changed that. The court had assembled by the time they reached the Great Hall. Word travelled fast inside stone walls, and a court that had been waiting in uncertainty for almost 2 weeks was not going to miss the moment of resolution. They were arranged along the sides of the hall in the loose, the half-formal way of people who have gathered without explicit instruction, curious, watchful, carefully calibrated in their expressions. Riker Ironvale stood at the front, Blaise Wintermere beside him, the remaining council members behind. Every face that had spent 4 months looking at Jocelyn as though she were furniture was now looking at her with the full, alert attention of people reassessing their understanding of a situation. Jocelyn stood in the entrance of the great hall in her travelling clothes, with her worn cloak and her dark hair loose from the road, and the small, barely visible evidence of her pregnancy just beginning to show at the front of her travelling coat. She looked, by every conventional measure, nothing like the composed, ceremonially appointed queen they had last seen at formal occasions. She looked exactly like herself. Kellen turned to address the court. "My queen has returned," he said, his voice carried to the far walls of the hall without effort. "I will be making several announcements regarding changes to council structure and palace governance in the coming days. This morning I want you to hear from Jocelyn first." He stepped back. He gave her the floor. Jocelyn looked at the assembled court. She looked at faces she recognized. Coulter Ravencrest near the back, who met her eyes briefly and dipped his head. Vader Ironvale, whose expression was carefully professional, but whose eyes were warm. Sienna Darkmoor, who had somehow appeared among the household staff, which Jocelyn thought she would need to ask about later. She looked at all of them, and she thought about 4 months of performing adequacy for people who had never expected her to be anything more than that. Then she spoke. Simply. The way she had always spoken when she was being herself, rather than the version of herself that the palace had designated. "Most of you know how I arrived here," she said. "I came as a peace arrangement, a political binding, and I spent 4 months trying to make myself useful within those terms, and smiling at the right moments, and doing everything expected of someone in my position. I did it because I thought that was what the role required." She paused. It wasn't enough. Not because I failed the role, but because the role itself was built wrong. You can't build a kingdom on arrangements. You can't build anything that lasts on terms rather than truth. The hall was very quiet, and I left because I was made to believe I didn't matter, she said. I came back because I decided, with nobody's permission but my own, that this place was worth fighting for. Not the political structure of it, but the actual people. The guard who let me through the gate because he saw me as a person rather than a position. The healer who told me the truth when she could have deflected. The herb trader in the outer settlements who said something kind to a stranger without being asked. She looked at Coulter Ravencrest, who was studying a point on the floor with great concentration. I am not asking for your approval, she continued. I am telling you who I am and what I intend to do with the position I hold and what I expect in return. I expect this court and this kingdom to be a place where truth is more valuable than arrangement, where people are seen as people, where the smallest member of this pack matters as much as the most powerful one. She placed one hand, briefly, against her stomach. That is the world I intend to raise my child in. It is the world I intend to build here, alongside my husband. I hope you'll help us. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Coulter Ravencrest at the back of the hall said quietly but very clearly, "We are glad you came back, my queen." Vader Ironvale said, "Veldmore is better for it." The murmur that moved through the hall after that was not unanimous. There were faces that remained carefully neutral, the faces of people who were waiting to see how the new order settled before committing to it. That was fine. She had not come back expecting unanimous anything. She had come back expecting to do the work. Nick Helen's hand found hers again, at her side. "Told you," he said, very quietly, for only her. She turned to look at him. "Told me what?" "That they would listen. That when you actually spoke, they would hear you." "I notice you didn't tell me that before I spoke," she said. "You didn't need me to." He looked at her with that expression she had first seen in the garden, the open, uncertain, genuinely present quality that made him look nothing like an alpha king and entirely like a person. That's rather the point. In the weeks that followed, Jocelyn moved through the palace differently than she ever had before. Not tentatively. She had used up her tentative allowance on the first 4 months. She moved with direction and intention, going where she meant to go, and saying what she meant to say, and asking the questions that had always occurred to her, but that she had suppressed in the interests of not taking up too much space. She established a regular meeting with Vader Ironvale and the palace's medical staff to discuss the welfare of pregnant wolves and young families within the pack. She organized a formal review of the border settlement-resettlement from the war, the families who had been displaced and returned but had received no formal support in rebuilding, and established a fund drawn from the palace's administrative budget to address the gaps. She began meeting twice weekly with a rotating group of pack families, ordinary wolves with ordinary concerns who had never before had direct access to anyone in the Queen's position. She also began to sleep through the night. This was, she later admitted to Kellen, the clearest possible evidence that she was truly home. She had not slept well since the day she arrived at Veldmore, not in the palace, not in the cave, not in the cottage. Something had always kept the back of her mind alert and vigilant, some unresolved question that her sleeping self was trying to work out. Now she slept. Kellen reorganized the council within the first 2 weeks. Blaise Wintermere and 2 other members who had most enthusiastically supported Brielle's influence were retired from their positions with formal courtesy and practical finality. He brought in Zane Frostvale, a territorial administrator with a record of prioritizing pack welfare over political convenience, and Kira Ravencrest, a council member from the Eastern Territories who had been recommended by every wolf she had ever worked with as someone who told the truth in rooms where the truth was inconvenient. He also instituted a formal requirement that any significant decision affecting pack families had to include input from the Queen before it could be ratified. This was not a minor procedural change. Several of the remaining council members made this clear. Kellen listened to their concerns with genuine attention and then confirmed the policy without modification. "She is my equal in this," he said. "That is not a negotiable position." He meant it. Jocelyn, watching him in council sessions, saw that he meant it, not because he was performing meaning for her benefit, but because something had genuinely shifted in how he understood the work. He consulted her on territorial decisions, not because the new policy required it, but because her perspective consistently revealed things that the existing frameworks had missed. She had a different vantage point than any of his previous advisors. She had arrived at Veldmore from the outside, from the losing side of a conflict, from a position where she had nothing to gain by presenting comfortable fictions to power. She saw what was actually there, and she told him. "You should have had someone like me in that room from the beginning," she told him once, in their shared study in the late evening, while she was reviewing resettlement files and he was reading territorial reports, the fire burning down between them. "I should have had you," he said, without looking up from his papers. "Specifically?" She looked at him. He looked up. "Is that too much?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's exactly right." She went back to her files. "Don't make a thing of it. I wasn't going to." He went back to his reports, and then, after a moment, "I like this." "What?" "This. Working next to you in the evening. It's my favorite part of the day." She considered this for a moment. "Mine too," she said. "Don't make a thing of that, either." Understood. The baby arrived on a clear morning in early spring, 6 months after Jocelyn walked back through the palace gates. He came into the world with the decisive energy of someone who had already decided how he felt about the whole situation and needed everyone to know immediately. Vader Ironvale caught him and declared him perfectly healthy, with the satisfaction of someone ticking a very important item off a list. He had dark hair, which he had from Kellen, and a particular set to his jaw that Vader observed, without elaborating, was very familiar. Jocelyn held him in the first minutes, while Kellen sat on the edge of the bed beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers, looking at his son with an expression he had given up trying to manage. "Hello?" Kellen said to the baby, in the quiet, unhurried tone he used for things that mattered. The baby looked in the general direction of the voice with the focused intensity of someone who has received information and is processing it. "He knows you already," Jocelyn said. "Is that—" "Yes. They learn voices before they arrive. He's been listening to you for months." Kellen was quiet for a moment. "I said some important things to you in the evenings," he told the baby, with complete seriousness. "I want you to know I meant all of them." The baby made a sound that was not quite a word, but carried the distinct impression of someone who had opinions and intended to share them at the earliest available opportunity. "He's going to be trouble," Jocelyn said. "Takes after his mother." She turned to look at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. They named him Kale. Months later, when the palace had settled into a rhythm that bore very little resemblance to the rhythm it had before, when the council sessions ran differently, and the Pack families had a direct line to their queen, and the East Wing had been reorganized to include a proper family space rather than the series of separate formal apartments it had been, Jocelyn went to the East Garden. She had not been back since she left. She had avoided it, not consciously, but by instinct, or the way you avoid a place that holds too much of a particular feeling until you are ready to go back to it without being undone by it. She was ready now. The fountain was running. The stone bench sat beside it where it always had. The garden had the particular clean smell of early spring. Cold air and green things just beginning. The smell of something that had been dormant, deciding to start again. She sat on the bench. She opened the book she had brought. She heard footsteps on the gravel path. She did not look up, because she already knew. Kellen sat beside her. He looked at the book in her hands, a different one from the migration study, this one about the history of the Eastern Territorial borders, which she was reading for practical reasons rather than for the pleasure of it, though the two were becoming increasingly difficult to separate. "What are you reading?" he asked. She told him. He asked a follow-up question. She answered. He asked another. The light shifted slowly across the garden in the late afternoon way. amber gold moving through the bare branches and laying itself across the stone in long, warm bars. The fountain ran. Somewhere above in the east wing, Cale was being walked by his attendant, which Jocelyn knew because she had heard his voice earlier, and it had the content, medium volume quality, that meant he was happy and attentive, and building toward tired. She thought about the morning she had packed her bag in the dark, the cold marble under her bare feet, the sound of Brielle's laughter through the door, the ceremonial necklace left behind on the velvet bed. She thought about the cave, and the cottage, the flutter in her abdomen on the step outside, the moment that had rearranged everything inside her, the ginger root tea, the crooked cradle. She thought about the clearing, Kellen's voice saying her name without any management in it. Just her name, like something being set down. She thought about what it meant to come back somewhere on your own terms, how different it was from arriving, how a place could be the same stones and corridors, and yet be an entirely different world, depending on who you were when you came to it and what you had decided to bring in with you. Kellen was reading over her shoulder now, which he had started doing at some point in the winter, a small domestic habit she had not asked for and had not pushed away. "You've highlighted this whole section," he observed. "It's important," she said. "Obviously." He settled beside her. "Though you've been reading for 20 minutes and haven't turned a page." She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression she had come to understand as his most honest one. The one he had spent years not allowing on his face. The one that looked like a man who had stopped pretending that something was less than it was. She closed the book. "Some arrangements," she said quietly, "become real not in the moment they're made, but in the 1,000 small moments after." He considered this. "Is that from the book?" "No," she said. "I'm telling you something." "I know," he said. "I'm listening." The fountain ran. The light moved. The garden held them in its late afternoon quiet. And Jocelyn Ashbourne, who had arrived at this palace as a peace offering, who had left it before dawn without a word, who had come back on her own terms carrying more than anyone had given her credit for, leaned her shoulder into her husband's and turned the page. And stayed.